The big epiphany in running a startup or two is once you get the funding to go and build your startup for the first time, just how free you are and how effective you can be at building something really, really fast, incredibly efficiently. If you would have asked me, say, even 5 years ago, how long my children would live,
Okay.
I probably would have said, maybe to 90. But I don't believe that anymore.
Now what do you believe?
This is Brain Inspired.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Middlebrooks. Have you ever built something that was launched into space and took pictures of another planet? Yeah, me either. Phillip Alvelda has, though, and he's my guest today. Phillip worked for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the 1980s and worked on multiple instruments that were launched into space for various reasons. And as you'll hear during that time, he did some related early work with neural networks. That is not what he does these days, though. After running a few startups over the years, winning lots of awards, patenting lots of things, and a stretch at DARPA overseeing multiple biotechnology projects that helped bring about our current brain-machine interface technologies, among other things, he has now started a company called BrainWorks, where he and his team focus on building brains, essentially, to make trustworthy, powerful AI. They use inspiration from neuroscience to build the hardware that powers their technology. So they're not just using deep learning to do their thing. And Phillip is a huge proponent of using as much neuroscience knowledge as possible to build AI. This is a little different than many of my previous episodes. We spend a good deal of time talking about entrepreneurship and startups and the difference between the academic and industry worlds, a little bit about AI, safety, and ethics. With regard to his company, BrainWorks, we talk a bit about their first product called Ambient Biometrics, which monitors a user's vital signs using a camera, like the camera on your smartphone, to reduce the friction with doctors' visits and health checkups and so on. And they are hiring, so check them out at brainworks.ai. Or you can learn more through the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/49. Dripping in Diamonds, Rebecca, Phillip, Hugo, and David. Thanks for supporting the show on Patreon. Your support and your patience will be rewarded. Speaking of diamonds, I tried last week to get my wife to sell her engagement ring that I bought many years ago now. Since, as you know, diamond engagement rings are just a ridiculous manufactured market that, yes, I gave into many years ago, basically just to avoid the judgment of family and friends, which is really embarrassing. But she won't do it. She won't sell yet. If this beautiful support keeps coming in, though, for the podcast, I may ease up on her. Maybe. Or maybe I can get Phillip Alvelda to hire me. All right, thanks for listening. I really enjoyed talking with Phillip, and I wish him success. And here's our conversation. Phillip, welcome, and thank you for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
I thought we were going to be doing a little face-to-face because it's over Skype, but right now our video cameras are off. So I guess you cannot tell me my heart rate right now. I know if you were seeing me, I know that you could tell me.
That's exactly right. Well, at least my our product could. I don't know if I could with my own naked eye.
Right. Well, I'm excited to have an entrepreneur on the show. So I've had one in the past. I enjoyed having Francisco de Salsa Weber on the show. He works on natural language understanding. But I've mostly had academics on, and not that you're not an academic, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. And I've had a few DeepMind folks on. But I've been working to get some more industry people on too. So, Phillip, you're the CEO of BrainWorks, which we will talk about soon as well. And you have a long academic and business career. So you have a different perspective than most of my guests, I guess, is what I'm saying here. And
yeah, what you're saying is I'm really old and I've been at it for a while.
I haven't had many geezers on the show, so this will be good. So, yeah, but you straddle neuroscience and AI, and you're also steeped in the business side of things. So this is going to be good. So when I was younger, I was old enough to reproduce, but still younger. My plan was to have the first baby in space. Since then, I've had a surgery actually that will prevent me from having any more children, and I can send you a picture of that if you'd like. But is that why you worked for NASA when you worked for NASA? Did you have the same plan as me?
Not exactly, but I was absolutely captured by the idea of launching things into space. And when I first started, I had the good fortune of being accepted to have a job at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory just before the Challenger blew up.
Oh man, I didn't realize the timing was such.
Yeah, and I was afraid that going in at that time, the whole shuttle program would be stalled or perhaps even shut down, and I'd be going to NASA to twiddle my thumbs where nothing ever got into space. But nothing could have been further from the truth. I went, I kind of buckled down. NASA did a fabulous job of kind of reinventing itself in the process, and I ended up having several instruments fly in space, which was, how many people, first job out of college.
God, that's so cool.
You get to build stuff that goes to another planet.
Yeah.
And I got to do it 3 times. One to Jupiter on Galileo, one to Venus on Magellan, one to Cassini on Cassini to Saturn, and then a couple instruments on the space shuttle. So I was almost, I threaded the needle to come in to have just huge opportunities. It was a really exciting time.
Man, that is exciting. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that later. And I like the way you phrased launching things into space as having children in space. I haven't thought of it that way. So that's a different way to think of it.
My babies
Your
are on
baby.
different.
Yeah, that's right. So first things first here, before we really get into it, I would love for your help with some listener mail, which is a rare thing I do on the show. Would you mind helping me answer a question?
Happy to help.
So I had a listener write in. He's an undergraduate. He's trying to decide whether to get an MD, PhD, or just a PhD. He's interested in neuroscience, and he's also interested in AI. He says, I can't imagine myself letting go of either possibility, medicinal neuroscience or AI/computational neuroscience research. But one worry is that he doesn't know how stable a non-medical career would be, but he also worries that if he goes the medical route, he could be missing out on super interesting research in the AI and neurosciences area. So what would you advise him? What path would you advise him to take? And you can, of course, feel free to.
That's a tough one. I would say, from my own experience, whatever you're most passionate about, go all in. And don't I wouldn't necessarily feel like by choosing one path for the moment, you're giving up another. I think that my governing principle of academic advice is go in the direction that keeps the most doors open. So if you're going to study something or go, choose an institution or choose a path, think about, if you do it, what doors stay open afterwards. Could I go into medicine and focus on clinical care and working with patients and treating them? Or do I want to work on a research program where, I have new problems every day? And very different kind of experiences. Both are super fulfilling for, the right kind of person. But, you probably have time for 2 or 3 careers in your lifetime, and I try not to be pigeonholed.
As you can attest, yeah, and as I can as well. But I guess, are we going to have another AI winter where he's not going to be funded if he goes the research route, But of course, there's always need for doctors, right?
Yeah, I think... I joke because, my mom had a plan for me when I was a kid. She had imagined from when I was very young that I would be a neurosurgeon. I was good with my hands. She taught medical school. Yeah. It was, kind of a perfect match. It was foiled when I ended up in the Cornell bookstore looking at that organic chemistry text with 1,000 pages of stick figures that I just want to memorize.
Yeah.
And then I wandered over to the physics section, and it was one quantum mechanics book, a 300-page book with one equation. So that I felt I could manage. So I ended up as a physicist, and that that worked out well for me because, physics was kind of a foundational science for many disciplines, taught a lot of analytical skills that were very generic and applicable everywhere. And, I went on later in grad school to work in computer science and electrical engineering and all the artificial intelligence work. So, I think, as long as you get a good foundation in biochemistry, kind of the precursors either for neuroscience or a good career in medicine, I think you've got a lot of jumping off points after that.
You really can't lose either way, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and the rapid changes in biochemistry and gene science, technology, synthetic biology, and whatnot, those are, I think, the really exploding areas of science right now. Here's a good test for you when you're in a college, kind of visiting. Get in the elevator and look at the bulletin board and the bulletins of what classes and seminars are in the elevator. and when you do that, compare it to the bulletins that you saw last month or last year. And if the bulletins are always the same from year to year, that's kind of a stagnant field. But I'll tell you, the bulletins that are new every year right now are all the biology, all the synthetic gene technologies.
Huh.
Those are just a rocket ship right now.
Speaking of rocket ships, so there you go, Mitchell. I hope that Phillip answered your question there and set you on your career path. So blame Phillip if it goes awry.
Don't try this at home, right?
Yeah. Speaking of rocket ships, I say that because every startup has a little picture of a rocket ship, and that's their little logo, right? But you are the CEO of BrainWorks, and so we're going to talk about BrainWorks in just a minute here. And you've had sort of a long history in entrepreneurship as well, kind of intermingled with your academic work. And if it's okay, I'd love to just ask you about entrepreneurship in general before we talk about BrainWorks specifically.
Sure.
So I was listening to I don't know if it was a Freakonomics podcast episode or maybe the Knowledge Project. I cannot remember, but the take-home message was that a lot of successful people in general have immigrant parents. And the idea was that they get their language from their mother. So they have like these great language skills and build good skills that way, and their work ethic from their fathers. Does that resonate with you?
Well, I definitely got work ethic from my dad, but my mom was a workhorse too. So I would say that she shared equally in that influence. Mom was a lifetime academic. Even founded a medical school and worked for the CDC. And Dad, of course, was one of the earliest technical people at the Coca-Cola company, and actually was the one that programmed the first IBM computer ever sold commercially, which was to Coke, to work on distributing bottling plant distribution.
Oh my gosh! My dad was the first person to take money out of an ATM in Louisiana for IBM. Actually, interesting.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so they both were very influential. And I think there is a lot to be said for the immigrant work ethic, where just if you take a population and you kind of look at who has the initiative to leave where they are in pursuit of something better versus just kind of sticking with the status quo, I think there's just an automatic filter for people that have more initiative.
Right.
And they, as they raise families, they're a good example of, what is it that you have to do to make sure that that your kids' lives are better than yours through your efforts, and that's your responsibility. So that was kind of programmed into me from a very young age.
And now that's you have children, right?
Absolutely.
And now that you're programming that into them, even though you're not an immigrant, I suppose.
Yeah, we're trying.
Yeah. No, I get it.
It's a constant struggle. I've got 2 teens, so I'm living it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so do you think that there is a fundamental difference in makeup between academics, let's say, and industry folks and entrepreneurs? Is there a bright line that separates these types of people?
I think initially no, but over time they tend to develop different habits of mind and work. And I think that I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast rule that one cannot transform themselves or straddle the two worlds. I've always really enjoyed having a hand in on both sides, and I've kind of drifted to both sides of the line from time to time in my career.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think some of the best academics are, keenly sensitive and involved in, commercial endeavors of some sort or the other, where, many of them have that not just, kind of a sense of what is academically interesting and appropriate and fundable, and how do you work within the university and tap that wellspring of innovation and fresh ideas from new students every year, versus, how do you take those kind of early explorations and expansions of what's possible and turn them into things that at scale can really impact industry and the world at large, which, small academic groups by themselves just don't have the total, man hours and hands and time to do the way they're organized. So, I think I think both worlds, well leveraged, kind of play off well against each other. And you like anything, you've got specialists on one side or the other, and then you've got generalists that can straddle. So all of them, I think, have important roles in advancing our society.
Well, it used to be kind of celebrated, crossing over more, like back in the day of Bell Labs, right? And then I don't know if that went away, but it seems like companies these days more and more are teaming up again with academic labs. Like, there's a lot of Google and DeepMind folks publishing paper with university labs and things like that. And I know that you've seen a lot of this kind of stuff. Is this a good thing, you think?
Well, when I was back at MIT, there was a moment where it seemed like every other professor was having a startup on the side, and where the hell are they for my office hours? Oh, they're at their startup.
Right.
And so sometimes, it was frustrating for the students to, not have the professor around. But then, you turn around next month and, oh, look, I can get an internship at the company next door that my professor's running. This is fantastic.
Oh, that is good. Yeah.
So I think there was a little bit of a double-edged sword in how do you manage it. But I think, that was at MIT, which was, always kind of innovation oriented. Stanford was very much like that. Cal Berkeley,
right.
Where I spent some time, in the area. And I think that notion of, empowering the students to create not just, new technologies, but companies to leverage them. That, of course, is that the tech startup idea, the Silicon Valley culture has started to really propagate beyond, the traditional, New England, Silicon Valley corridors. And I think that's a really good trend, but it's hard to kind of recreate the big ecosystem that lets a company scale quickly. So that's, still a work in progress for many cities.
Interesting. So you do have kids, and I have children too, and trying to explain having children to people who don't have children is just a lost cause, I find. Words aren't enough, and it's impossible to paint the complete picture.
I even say it's only people that have no kids or only one child that give parenting advice, because as soon as you have two, you realize that what worked for the first one really doesn't apply to the second one.
I know. And then it's also that having two actually is somehow twice as hard as having one. I don't understand how.
Yes, and these people that have three or more that have to go to zone defense, I don't understand how they manage.
This is why I had surgery, man. This is why I had surgery. But anyway, I feel that way about entrepreneurship as well. Like, nobody really gets it unless they either do it or have done it, And I don't know if you feel that same way, but what is something that entrepreneurship has taught you that you think that academics might be missing out on?
Well, I think the most important thing about a startup in particular, and so not just general entrepreneurship, but being in a startup,
yep,
is the amount of impact you can have with minimalist bureaucracy. Today's university is a quagmire of administration and organizations and committees and stagnant processes for starting new schools and new programs, and then of course you've got all the vagaries of government agency funding and how to wrangle it, and the old boys networks running them and so on. So those are all things that constrain you, and I think that there's kind of intellectual freedom at the university that you don't necessarily have at a company, to kind of pursue, whimsical ideas that come upon you, assuming you can get funding for them. But there's not really operational flexibility. There's big bureaucracy and financial constraints and how many students can you have and all that sort of thing. So I think the big epiphany in running a startup or two is once you get the funding to go and build your startup for the first time, just how free you are and how effective you can be at building something really, really fast, incredibly efficiently. And the type of people, though, that you need to do that, there's really a different mindset once you're there, where you never know what's going to happen in the next day. Everything's very uncertain. Your paycheck is good for another 6 months, but after that you'll run out of money, so you better figure something out. But it's you doing the figuring. There's no committee that's preventing you. There's no bureaucracy that you're waiting on for a decision. You are building it.
Well, it forces efficiency too, right?
Yes, it forces efficiency, and it also forces a little bit of kind of flexibility and general kind of tolerance of ambiguity and being able to do the job that needs doing, even though you didn't plan for it in the moment. I'll give you an example. I had one of the first companies I started, Microdisplay. We were making we'd invented the technology for the displays that were inside the Google Glass ultimately. Mm-hmm. And I was the CEO of this company. I started as my first company out of MIT. And there's a day where, one of my electronic engineers who specialized in circuit board design, came to find me and say, "Hey, Phil, I'm frustrated because, I feel like I'm doing technician work and I'm doing like board testing and assembly that any technician could do, to get these development kits out to the customers. And I really want to design the new stuff and do some of the more interesting work." And the irony, of course, was that to tell me this, he had to find me in the warehouse where I was moving boxes.
Yeah.
And I was moving boxes because I was organizing them to be shipped out, and there was no one else there to do it.
No one was there.
So the CEO picks up the boxes and moves them because that's what the job of the day was. And so I said, well, the boards have to be assembled and tested. The boxes need to be loaded on the trucks. If you want to move the boxes, I'll do the assembly and testing.
Oh, see, that's where you got to fire him on the spot and say, "Go start your own damn company."
and he, chuckled and said, "Okay, I'll assemble the boards."
Yeah.
But I think it's one way to think of a good startup is that when it's you and your co-founders, you're wearing all the hats. You have to do everything.
Yeah.
And your job in a lot of ways is to grow the company as quickly as you can, so you can hand as many hats off to other people to scale the thing up quickly, and wield more corporate ability and operational kind of strength and capability.
How much does that bog down the creative vision?
For the right startup and the right people, it doesn't, because all of those practical issues, they're the real things that you're contending with. I mean, you're not just contending with your ideas. You're contending with the physics of the real world. You have to ship things. You have to satisfy customers. You have to, do all of these things to have real impact. And it's not necessarily that it's not creative. I mean, part of the creative process in the startup is, how can we do with 2 people what Cisco does with 50?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, there's a lot of creativity in that, a lot of frustration, a lot of risk, a lot of ambiguity. Some days with dicey paychecks, but there is nothing like it. Once you do a couple startups and with a good team, you never want to go back to a bureaucracy.
Well, that was my next question: is do you recommend it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, not for everyone. I mean, there are people where, you're in a stage of life where you can't afford the risk, and maybe you have obligations in education support or alimony or mortgages. And what I find is that I think it's great for a lot of people who have some tolerance for risk and ambiguity and a thirst for adventure, that it's absolutely something you should try, but timing it is important. I kind of joke that there's a great time to start a company, which is just after you get out of school, whether it's undergrad or grad school.
Why's that?
And you've already been kind of hammered into lean and hungry existence, with your budget, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
And you're used to ramen noodles and mac and cheese kind of dinners. And I kind of joke that your first job as a startup founder is you need to get to ramen noodle profitability, which is basically you need to be making enough money to pay for your ramen noodles and sustain yourself
Yeah.
while you build the rest of the company. So later in times in life, it's sometimes there are times when you just can't manage it, financially and logistically. But every once in a while, life will throw you a curveball, and you can say, oh, I had a minor windfall, and I can survive without a paycheck for 8 months, 12 months. Let's start a company and see how it goes. But it's absolutely worth it. It's an experience like no other.
I'll ask you in a year or so, and so we'll see how BrainWorks is going. So
yeah, well, this is number 3 or 4 for me. So I'm clearly I joke about this startup bug being a little bit like a drug addiction.
Oh man, yeah, it's got to be. Well, so you're used to. Let's talk about BrainWorks a little bit here. So you're used to giving, or you used to be. Well, I don't know what you're used to, but you've given a lot of academic-like talks where you dive into technical details, like how much information is encoded in single neurons versus a distributed population of neurons. How AI can benefit from understanding how a lot of different brain areas contribute to cognition and so on. But ambient biometrics is a bit of a left turn for you. I've seen you with your CEO hat on in talks as well, talking about ambient biometrics. So what is ambient biometrics, and how does it fit within BrainWorks, and how does it work?
Yeah, well, BrainWorks, the way to think of BrainWorks is we're a little bit of a dual-headed beast where, BrainWorks is intended to be a foundry where we make brains that can solve problems that more pedestrian AI tools, can't manage. Yeah. Because we're incorporating some new technologies that came out of the work from DARPA. And for us, when you build a company, it's great to have a nice technology that does new stuff, but the guts of the company has to be something that is a financial engine that people care enough about to pay for. Yeah. That you can use to then, grow the company larger. And so what we did was we went through quite an extensive process when we were saying, all right, well, these are the core technology nuggets that we have that we think could empower big new industrial capabilities. Which are the ones that we build first, and what is the industry and the problem that we're trying to solve that if we build that one piece, we solve this one problem, and that could be our first product that drives the revenue that we grow the company on. And so the second part of the company, besides kind of the technical underpinnings of the new AI engine that we build to make these more complete brains that think more like humans, is that application and service that uses it to do something meaningful. And that really is the ambient biometrics as our first product, where we targeted the delivery of healthcare. And we're looking at the healthcare industry, and kind of the process we went through was to look at the world and say, where is there a big intractable problem that our current solutions, really just can't address them? And we looked at education and transportation and energy and a whole set of potential areas where we could apply these things. And we ended up looking in particular again and again. We kept coming back to the basic demographic problem that is now just a global phenomenon where fertility rates are falling, the age pyramid, the population pyramid is inverting. You look at Japan, Korea, China, Spain, Italy, they are already in a position where they don't have enough young, healthy healthcare workers to treat the increasing number and needs of elderly. Yeah. And this is something where, those nations are kind of ahead of the rest of us, but we're all following. We had the lowest birth rate. UK had the lowest birth rate in their history. Everyone is headed in this direction of an increasingly aged population. So the fundamental question is, how do you care for them when we don't have enough people? So it means you have to automate the things. But healthcare delivery is a very manual, hands-on task. And it's complicated, and anything can happen. And so we began looking at that space to say, well, where could we have a meaningful impact? How can we change the equation of how many people does it take to care for, how many need it? And we realized that there was one aspect that everyone had taken for granted because we'd been doing it the same way every time, but it turns out it's a huge burden. And that is the taking of vital signs. Think about it. Every medical procedure in the United States is mandated by the FDA that it requires you, before you engage in a diagnostic activity, that you take the vital signs of the patient and use it to assess their state of health.
It's also mandated that you sit in a waiting room for an hour, right?
Well, I wish that weren't mandated, but I think that's part of the effect of not having enough people.
Yeah.
And that, that factors into the cost. So now you've got a waiting room. Everyone's wasting time, sitting there. You need a nurse and a half. You need you get taken into the little treatment area, height and weight, any problems, blood pressure. The whole thing takes, something like 30 minutes within the clinic, and, all of that, you amortize all that cost. Turns out it's really expensive, takes a long time, limits how many people you can treat, limits how much time the doctor and the nurses can spend with you. So it really is a huge burden that everyone has accepted because it hasn't changed for so long. And when we realize that, well, hey, wait a second, it used to be that you have to touch people to figure out, what their pulse rate and blood pressure are, use a cuff or a lead and so on. But we had seen some demonstrations that, some studio grade cameras at MIT, a guy named Bill Freeman did some really nice work with his grad students there, that used a camera to be able to pull out pulse rate. And he demonstrated that it was possible using, a super high quality camera and studio lighting and, a patient that's not really moving. And while that was a good technology demo, it really wasn't a workable product because it didn't account for all the vagaries of people moving around and different skin tones and changes in lighting and, all that sort of thing. And now the patient's talking, so, what does that do to the readings? So it showed that it was possible, but it wasn't quite possible with the garden variety tools and in the environment of the common clinic. But this looked like a perfect opportunity for us because it turns out that a lot of the principles of how the brain works, how the retina works, how, the sheet of neurons in your eye that are light sensitive. It's really remarkable when you think about it because each one of those neurons, they're really slow and noisy and imprecise. And yet your vision has very high acuity. You have incredible precision in being able to see things with a good corrected eyesight.
Mm-hmm.
But the individual neuron is very poor performing. So how is that? Well, it turns out we've discovered some of those principles of how that operates, and we can apply that to extract more information from regular camera signals than the traditional signal processing techniques. So, you can think of us as taking these new AI principles and pushing them all the way down in the sensor to be able to get more information from the instrument.
So these aren't, I don't know how secretive the actual technology is, but these aren't just convolutional deep nets that are at work here.
No.
Huh? Yeah.
No. It's we are using some convolutional techniques and some deep learning learning components, but it's deeper. It's in the architecture. It's in the data representation.
Interesting.
It's in the data processing. So it's thinking of it more physical modeling in the design of the system.
Yeah.
According to how the neurons operate. So it's less building a neural network than abstracting the principles of how the neural network operates and then using the math to do the analysis. So we often will say, if you think about how do you make a flying machine, we make jets now that are much faster than flapping wings. But it was by looking at the flapping wings that we extracted the math and the physics of the flight and how it worked.
Mm-hmm.
Same type of challenges in building a system like this. There's another interesting kind of neural aspect to what we're doing, where we look at how the visual cortex kind of amplifies signals that you're attending to and suppresses signals that are noisy or not relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And we're able to use some of those techniques to kind of enhance and determine when you take a measurement, we can actually get an estimate of its quality and precision as we're taking each individual measurement. So these are the kinds of technologies that we're deriving from these brain-inspired learnings from the brain-machine interface programs.
So are these like patent pending technologies?
That's exactly right. So we have several patents filed and kind of more in the works.
Cool.
But that's part of the fun in the startup. How do you kind of keep enough secret and tell people enough to get them excited while you're protecting yourself?
Well, we kind of skipped over. So I'll link to videos of you presenting this, but you demo the Ambient Biometrics product on stage where you get into the range of the camera. It recognizes you and it says, CEO, yes, may I get you some coffee? And then it starts taking your vital signs, right?
we haven't finished the coffee feature yet. But,
I see. I see.
But we'll put it on your feature request list.
Yes.
I think that's pretty much more or less how it works. And so the technology that we're applying, all of these new brain-inspired ideas, we've now built a complete system that has several components of AI assembled in one system that all together completely automates the process of taking vital signs. And all the person has to do is wander in range of the camera. And so, when we talk about ambient biometrics, we mean that it's ambient in the sense that it's part of the environment, and you don't even have to really pay attention. You don't need a nurse, you don't need a doctor. The patient doesn't even necessarily need to be aware that it's happening. We can use a camera that's overlooking the waiting room, and just by being in the waiting room, your vital signs are being assessed.
Mm.
And you don't necessarily even need a person because, having been to the doctor's office before, we've had pictures of you in the past. We know we use facial recognition to figure out who you are. If you're in one of the consenting patient databases, we then start doing the analysis and the recording of your vital signs and log it automatically to your health record. So it's a system that, replaces, all of that cost, all of that time, all those people in just the administrative and bureaucratic process of assessing your vital signs before anything happens with a doctor. So we can kind of really overturn the physical costs of and the operational burden of doing that whole process. And one of the other exciting bits of it is, we talk a lot about it being ambient in the sense that you just set up a webcam in the waiting room, but it could also be installed in the laptop that you work in front of. It could be in the smart TV in your living room while grandma is watching Jeopardy. It can be in your smartphone or your tablet. When you call up a doctor for advice, the system can be taking your vital signs and relaying them to a doctor that's remote. So a lot of what used to require you to get in the car and drive to a hospital or a clinic, now we can do while you are anywhere within the cell phone network. So I think there's huge opportunities to kind of reinvent a lot of processes within the hospitals and clinics, but also kind of break down the walls that limit your necessity to be in a clinic and expand the ability to monitor people, pretty much anywhere, anytime.
So, a lot of this sounds like Big Brother, right? I'm sure you get a lot of immediate reaction about that. So we'll have to talk about ethics here. I don't
Absolutely.
know. I don't know if you want to go ahead and talk about it. I mean, camera in the waiting room, and so on the one hand, this sounds so great because it's ambient, right? And the reality is we have cameras on us anywhere we walk around in public, just about, and we're being recorded, right? And everyone kind of accepts that. But that information is not being used to improve your health. It's only being used in case you do something wrong, for instance, right?
Yes. Well, that's the very nature of the double-edged sword of advanced technologies. Any advanced technology really can be used for good or ill, and the ethics of the companies and the regulations and certifications, the norms that you have in your company are all super important in determining who should have access to the technology and where it can and should be deployed. Because you're right, the same facial recognition technologies that could be used to automatically assess your health on an ongoing basis and give you preventive warnings when you're headed for a crisis. It's the very same technology that an oppressive government can use to refine your citizenship score based on how you behave, say.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is one of the uses that we've seen some press about in China.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. China, and raise your insurance as well, of something like that.
Exactly. Well, we have been approached by insurance companies to help actuarial analysis but there's applications everywhere that can benefit. So I don't know if you're aware, but all the new Teslas, Model 3s, they have an internal passenger-facing camera. The airlines have passenger-facing cameras in the seat backs. And it's not to spy on you. It genuinely is to help in many ways. And so detect: are you injured? Are you awake? Are you drowsy? Does there need to be some sort of intervention or rescue? And I think that we're at a really interesting time where these technologies are advancing so fast that I don't see the kind of societal conversations keeping pace.
No, yeah, well, it's coming more and more, I think. I just read the Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I'm not sure if you've read that, but it's about how basically social media companies are terrible and reduce humans to data to be harvested, essentially. And even though they maybe didn't start out that way, right?
Yeah.
So you have like these maybe good intentions that that then can be used for evil later, right? The do no evil of Google is no longer in their company slogans and stuff. I don't know. I don't even remember my point now that I was going to say.
Well, just that there are absolutely privacy concerns, and
well, that's what I was going to ask is because so the way in the age of surveillance capitalism. Sorry to interrupt. They one of the things that, for instance, Google, and I don't mean to harp on Google, but like with the Street View camera things, right? They just do it and then get permission later, and then they would have lawsuits, but they would just keep doing it, and then eventually it becomes accepted, right? And I'm wondering if our own sense of privacy, our right to privacy, if that is changing on a societal level. I mean, people are just so addicted to social media and will just post, their entire lives on it, not knowing that what is actually happening is they are being the data is they're just giving these social companies more data, right, to improve, to then sell them more stuff or whatever. But we don't care. We don't care that people are watching us as much anymore. And I'm wondering if that's a trend.
I don't.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know that I would say that most people don't care. I think that there's probably a very small minority, and I mean less than 1 or 2%, that are technically savvy enough, are aware of the technologies and the practices, are thinking about it, and are making a conscious decision about how to or not give away your personal data.
Mm.
And I think that part of the challenge is that these technologies now, they come about so fast. If you think about the ramp up of Facebook versus the ramp up of, say, GE,
right?
You're taking 30 years versus 3. It's a factor of 10 faster.
Are they going away just as fast too, or is it just a ramp up?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think, we'll see how that fraud case comes out for GE. But, the bigger issue is that you've got, huge swaths of the U.S. that didn't even make a transformation into the information economy. They don't have jobs, they don't have experiences, they're not involved in any of this technology development.
Right.
And yet they are, avid users of technology that they have, no clue of or experience in how they came about or even how they work. And so, I think that part of the issue of it's like you got to be a little careful when you describe these companies as doing something as if it was unethical or illegal.
Right.
And then people are catching up with them later. Well, that's kind of the nature of technology development. Before the thing is even possible and people are aware of it being possible, there is no legislative framework or laws or regulatory environment to even attribute what's allowable or not. And so they just do it. They're trying to I think honestly, in its early days, Facebook was well intentioned, and their goal to make money ultimately subverted a business model that was exploited in a way that they didn't even fully appreciate and expect. And it was only after the fact that they realized the horrific impact that it had, and but they're making money from it. And the old saying that it's hard to convince someone against an idea that their paycheck depends on. So
sure,
now they're stuck a little bit behind that. But I think that every technology entrepreneur lives this dream of having real world impact, and maintaining an ethical standard of some sort, has different importance in different companies. But there's no guide. You're inventing new stuff, and the laws and the politicians, they just cannot keep up with the pace of technology. They have not proven capable.
Yeah, well, it's difficult for anyone. Things are happening so fast. I mean, I know that you talk a lot about concern for ethical AI and building empathy, for instance, into AI. I mean, is the technology that you're building, are you finding it a hard sell with anyone? I mean, are you coming up against resistance to the ethical implications or anything, or is it smooth sailing?
Well, I wouldn't say it. So far for us, it has been smooth sailing because we've been very, very careful to make sure that when we talk about what the system is doing, we highlight all of the measures, both within the company and how it operates, and within the product and how it's governed and operated, so that it maintains, the very highest standards of protecting confidentiality and consent, and all of those, grounding principles of strong ethics. And so when we show that and we demonstrate how it works and we show the utility and the impact, so far the response has been overwhelmingly positive.
Well, it could really help a lot of people. So
yeah, and it's a sort of thing that's clearly transformative, and you begin to start to have questions when you're approached by people that want to use it for other purposes that might not be, aligned with the benefit of the user. So that's where, kind of the ethical backbone of the company and the company leadership come in, where, you need to figure out how to, hold that line.
Yeah, I'm on board, when you give the demo and it's on your laptop, and I mean, there are all sorts of concerns, I suppose. And I know that you guys are working on keeping keeping it private, but then you mentioned having the camera in, for instance, a waiting room, right, in a clinic or whatever. And I think, man, there are just so many different places where data where there could be a tributary or an offshoot of the data that's just being copied somewhere else. It's a scary world out there, man.
It is, and this is where there does need to be some regulation.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I wouldn't say new regulation. I would often point to the fact that we've got very strong privacy regulations and ethics regulations in medicine. But there needs to be some, real diligent work to figure out how do you extend those principles and stay consistent to them as you expand them to cover these new technologies and applications. I hear a lot of, teeth gnashing and hair rending about, should we regulate AI? Regulating AI is like saying, should we regulate cars? Well, we do regulate cars.
Right.
You have to wear seatbelts. You can only drive it so fast. There's all sorts of things that we have as a society kind of agreed to manage. But it's not that the tool itself, it's easy. You regulate its use. So there's some really interesting work to be done in figuring out what are the best mechanisms and tools and societal constructs to manage it.
It doesn't matter because people will they'll get their biometric data and then they're going to post it to Facebook anyway. Right.
It wouldn't surprise me.
You'll see like the Rock or something. So one of these high profile people. People probably do that with Fitbits. I don't know.
My VO2 Max and my Strava stats all together. Yeah. There
you go. So this is great. So I know that you guys are developing the ambient biometrics more. It's like, is it ready to go? I know that you're. So what's the status of the ambient biometrics? And then I also just want to know the sort of long-term vision of BrainWorks in general.
Yeah. So the ambient biometrics product has made great strides. We've integrated kind of the pulse rate and variability sensing, as well as the respiratory rate and information sensing. And then, of course, we're working on a long list of other physical biometrics that we will measure, both remotely and directly. But we have a kind of a long-term roadmap for kind of expanding in two dimensions for this product line. The first dimension is, every quarter we expect to measure more stuff. What is your heart rate? What's your breathing? What's your pulse, your blood pressure, and then expanding into other biometrics, not just of physical health, but mental health. What is your emotional state? Are you in pain? Do you look injured? Do you have some sort of motion control malady, whether it's, Parkinson's or dementia that changes how you can move? And can we track the increase of severity? So that's one dimension is, every quarter, just using the same kind of camera sensing infrastructure, we can measure more and more things.
So you have you guys are like doing an agile sprint, and every sprint, the product to ship is something new to measure with the technology?
That's right.
Cool.
That's right. And the where we've already installed it, it becomes more capable in that existing installation.
Yeah.
So it's just, this is the power of the cloud. We can spool up a a new node and a new geography in about 15 minutes, max.
Yeah.
Sometimes even faster. It's really remarkable.
Huh.
But so that's one dimension, is always measuring more stuff, learning more about you, having a better idea of what your health is. The other dimension is, as we collect data, we're going to be doing more and more with it. So the first product is mostly doing the measurements and collecting the data and storing it in the records, and setting some gross alarms of are you in some sort of dangerous condition. The next stage, of course, is using that data to develop the next kind of stepping stone, which is diagnostics. So having looked at a lot of data, can we identify specific conditions and help doctors make decisions with greater accuracy and covering broader demographics and finding other conditions that they might not find with their naked eyes. And then once we've done that stepping stone, then we have plans for a subsequent one, which says, all right, well, now once we collect a bunch of diagnostic data and the trends of those diagnostics over time, then we can begin to build predictive analytics. So not only are we looking at your state of health, we're looking at what is the long-term trend of your state of health and make predictions as to whether or not you're headed for a crisis or not. And and so then that's kind of the third stepping stone. And then of course we have a progression of those going forward as we make the platform more capable, both in the data that it collects and what it does with that data.
There's got to be a lot of competition out there in this domain, no?
Well, you would think, and I think that we look at people that are working on narrow aspects of the problem, and so you have systems that, for example, there was a lot of press of the Stanford group that looked at the radiology to find breast cancer, or flu symptoms in chest X-rays, in advance or with higher performance than the real doctors. But the problem with a lot of those is that they're kind of single point solutions, and they're not integrated in the larger medical workflow systems yet, and they're not really trusted yet. And so our goal is to be kind of the system that can pull all of that together and unify it in a way that you can have conversations about it, and you can build systems that are trustworthy, that really are part of a larger medical solution rather than a point problem in a demonstration. So I would say, more than competition, I think there's a lot of opportunity to take some of these new technologies and fold them into really world-changing systems that have huge global impact.
Maybe Mitchell needs to go work for you, the guy that we helped at the beginning.
Well, send in a resume. We are hiring.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. You're hiring, huh?
We absolutely are.
So, Philip, let's see. In the interest of time, maybe we could. So, I think that what we're going to we'll continue to talk about BrainWorks some, but maybe we can take that hat off and put on an AI in general hat. Does that sound okay?
Sure. That sounds great.
So, you have seen the rise of deep learning, and you actually worked with neural nets in the 80s at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which we talked about at NASA. And in fact, let me read a title of one of your early papers here. Neural Network Star Pattern Recognition for Spacecraft Attitude Determination and Control. And I want to read just something from the abstract here. Quote, this is from the 80s. New computer architectures based on the anatomy of the human brain seem to promise high-speed and fault-tolerant solutions to the limitations of serial processing. This paper discusses the latest applications of artificial neural networks to the problem of star pattern recognition for spacecraft attitude determination. End quote. Cool. what was
Blast for the past?
Yeah, man. What was the feel of those early neural network days like during your Jet Propulsion Laboratory days? Were people like, because they weren't working as well back then. Were people like kicking their big boxy computers and cursing at the neural nets?
Well, they're at that time, most people had no idea that neural nets even existed as a technology.
Well, they barely did.
Well, NASA didn't have anyone working on it when I was there.
Yeah. And
we were in a very traditional, kind of electronics and sensor driven group. And in fact, we were using, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but we were actually using the first ever charge coupled device sensors, the first digital cameras. We built two of the first ones ever that launched on Galileo to take digital pictures of Jupiter. And there were two instruments in parallel. One was a scientific instrument that would take the pictures with the digital sensor, and we were working on the one that would control the spacecraft, which would track stars and the limb of the planet. So kind of the shape of the curve of the atmosphere, to be able to point the telescope accurately and keep it pointed in a specific direction.
Yeah.
And we also were responsible for the instruments that would figure out which way the spacecraft was going and which way it was pointing, by using the sun and by figuring out where Earth was. And those instruments were really bulky and really heavy. It was something like 22 kilograms of instruments just to figure out where the sun was, and then kind of orient the spacecraft around the sun to figure out where Canopus was, another bright star. And between that and the sun, we could kind of figure out where the spacecraft was and know where to point the antenna to talk to Earth and get commands, as to what it should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, 22 kilograms of instrumentation was a lot. Very expensive to launch that into space. Tens of millions of dollars, per kilogram. Think of that sort of budget.
Yeah.
And so that was a really exciting project. But yeah, the challenge was, of course, to replace all that with something that would be much smaller and more powerful. And for me, there was this, holy smokes moment when I wasn't even aware of neural networks at the time, and I just happened to go to a talk by a guy named Terry Sinowski, who's kind of one of the grand old men of AI.
He's been on the show, yeah.
He's awesome, and he was giving a talk at Caltech about using these new backpropagation networks to generate synthesized speech.
Oh yeah, his TalkNet. I don't remember what it's called.
NetTalk.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the moment in the Caltech auditorium where he plays it, and the holy crap moment for me was, not so much that he's talking about the architecture and that it can perform this well, but there was a moment where he would play the learning algorithm, he would play the speech output of the synthesizer at each stage of the learning.
Right. Oh yeah. And
it was fantastic because it mimicked exactly the sequence of nonsense sounds that babies make when they're learning to speak. And that was the moment, like, oh my God, that's got to be it.
Yeah.
It's just too close. And that was the I didn't sleep for like 3 or 4 nights. And went home and hacked a simulator, to do this and see what else I could apply it to. And I happened to be working on this problem of figuring out where to point the spacecraft in the instruments, and that's how I ended up developing that technology. And so it turned out that the traditional mechanism for doing that attitude determination task of figuring out how to point the spacecraft used to take 22 kilograms of equipment and about 500 kilobytes of storage for the star pattern catalog that would figure out where you were. And I replaced it with like 4 grams of a single chip sensor and 4K of memory.
You saved millions. So
that was kind of a watershed moment where people were like, maybe it is useful.
Oh, so cool. It's come a long way since then as well.
Yeah, it has. And, in that era, I'll confess to, contributing to the AI winter myself because, I worked in the neuroscience group for a while, and I kind of came to the conclusion that with the capabilities of the computers we had back then, we jokingly used to say I'd say half jokingly really, that these neural networks, they were very cool, but they were kind of the second best solution to any problem.
Yeah.
If you really worked on customizing something with, extreme bit twiddling and, limited design of hardware, custom architectures, you could do a little bit better. But that, of course, has changed now. With the explosion in data, the exponential increases in processing power, those Fitbit, powered, satellites, basically, they were not really representative of what the technologies could do.
Yeah. Well, I know that you're all in on neuroscience these days, contributing to AI.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's kind of interesting because there's an argument to be made that AI doesn't need neuroscience, right? So this is like you just mentioned that you could do better with what we had then, better than neural networks, right? If you kind of tweak things and you could scrap a few things together and you could outperform the neural networks. And very few people, let's say, I won't say no one, but really foresaw the success of what's now known as deep learning. And I know that it's not the end all deep learning, but things are just hard to predict how they're going to turn out.
Well, I don't know. There were a few of the early acolytes, the three guys that recently got the Turing Award.
I know, and Terry was one too. Yeah, Terry's always been a pusher of the networks. And the need for incorporating like the neuro-inspired technology into it as well.
Yes.
But so how much neuroscience do you think that AI really needs to push forward?
Well, I think that there's productive paths both with and without neuroscience, and I think part of what you have to look at are what problems are you trying to solve. I often lament, how much effort goes into deep learning.
Yeah.
Where there's you can spend an infinity of time, worrying about your numerical algorithm optimization, so that you don't get trapped in local minima, and you have annealing, and there's all these kind of techniques to increase the training rate and one-shot learning and so on. So there's an explosion of those things from a kind of mechanistic and operational perspective, and I think that those are important to industrialize the use of the algorithm. So I don't want to diminish or talk down for efforts to develop that. And if you look at the way they're being used at scale in industry, they're clearly using it to do things people care about, and they're now being built into the phones and all the photo apps, and so you're seeing an explosion of how to use it. But the most exciting opportunities to me are the ones where we create not kind of incremental improvements in numerical or computational efficiency, but the ones where we create a transformative new ability that the system didn't have before.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems that is kind of inherent in the kind of deep learning algorithms at scale is, I'd say, the combinatorial explosion of complexity when you try to incorporate, multiple problem domains, multiple, data representations and formats, gross disparities in challenge that couple different domains and ways. So let me give you an example. So a narrow problem that is tractable is one where you've got a single domain and you're solving a very specific problem in it. So you're looking for faces and photos.
Yep.
Those now we've nailed, and they're getting better every year, and there's better hardware to do it more efficiently with lower power and so on. So we're on that development train. But if you say, can you successfully identify sex traffickers, from their facial images?
Eesh. Yeah.
Okay, that's a different type of question. Now you're into ethics. Now you're into privacy. Now you're into emotional detection, ideas of abstraction of what represents an emotion. Can you, from an images of two different people near each other, can you infer the relationship between them? Is one the sex trafficking victim and the other the perpetrator, or is it a father and daughter?
Yeah.
So those are things that a trained person can actually detect, and I've actually been approached to think about, could we begin to solve some of those problems, and be able to see that in an automated way. But those types of challenges where you're taking, social contracts, individual emotions, legal requirements, privacy protection, you're starting to make bigger problems that are much more complicated. And we haven't even talked about, asking ethics-based questions, which are even more kind of abstract. So I think building systems to solve those more complicated challenges, that's where I think the real transformative opportunities lie.
With incorporating neuroscientific knowledge into it?
Yes, well, because we know that humans can do it. We have examples. We have proof by example.
That's right. Sure.
And so then the question becomes, well, all right, what cognitive armamentarium do you have that you've employed in your head to solve these more, integrated, more, sensory fusion, more complicated multi-domain problems. And, the way we talk about it within BrainWorks is, well, clearly we haven't built the parts of your brain yet that represent your biological ability to do that.
Right. All we need is cortex, right? That's all we need.
Well, we need more of that. We need parts of the lizard brain too. We need your emotions. We need your representation of fear and harm and benefit and all these abstractions that are so integral to everything that we do and detect and see and have empathy for, that are central to our decision making.
So the longer term vision for AI is to build artificial general intelligence. Let's say that's a main one. Let's say, and
yes.
But given that we don't agree on the definition of intelligence, or very few people seem to have the same definition, or the full story of what even makes us intelligent, how will we know when we've built general AI?
Well, I'm not a big believer in this cataclysmic transformation. For one moment we haven't invented it, and then holy smokes, and then we have artificial general intelligence today.
Look out! Yeah.
I don't see that sort of evolution. A lot of people say, are we headed for a robo apocalypse? I don't think so. I'm not following down the Elon Musk path in that regard.
As a quick tangent, back in the 80s when you were working with neural nets, or even in the 90s with the connectionism sort of rise, people didn't seem to have these same concerns, or they weren't as vocal about it anyway.
No, well, I think there's a couple of things that are feeding it. One is this notion that this idea of exponential technologies, when you hit the curve and the exponent, boy, they really advance quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great kind of general philosophy, but it leaves out kind of some of the bigger system complexity issues. And if you look at the way science is advancing in the field, it's not like there's a general aspect of all intelligence and there's one solution that satisfies all of it.
Right.
The way it seems to be progressing is, we're kind of looking at, well, gee, how does the brain handle binocular convergence of, integrating your two eye inputs to figure out depth. Okay.
Yeah.
So we figured out that circuit.
That one's gonna become conscious and take over the world, I believe.
Well, the point is, that's one circuit among, hundreds of thousands. And so, we've now checked that one off. And DARPA has made huge strides in that way where, we're looking at, doing memory integration in RAM and sensory feedback in haptics and, sensory input to the visual and auditory cortex in NESD.
Yeah.
So each program is working on one portion of the brain. And the way it's happening in kind of the brain machine interface world is, as we figure that one circuit out of the brain and what the coding is and what the architecture and the data representation and the histology, then we can, for someone that has had that part, injured or removed or, absent through genetic defect, we can now put a machine in to replicate the function of that missing piece. But that's just a tiny piece. So what we're doing is, step by step, we're building more and more of the components. Is there going to come a day where we connect up enough of them that it begins to, seem more alive?
Yeah.
Yeah, bit by bit, but I don't think it's going to sneak up on us.
Yeah, I don't know. My dad just talking to the navigator in the car back when there were those little navigators. You didn't use your phone. He'd talk to the woman, and it's embarrassing, but it's like, it doesn't take much for us to anthropomorphize machines, I suppose.
No. And, there's a lot of cases these days where that's a good thing because, for example, there have been some interesting studies where like suicide hotlines and drug treatment hotlines, people will tell an automated bot way more than they'll tell another person.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah.
They're not ashamed to talk to a robot where they would suffer some, social damage if they opened up to a person and made themselves vulnerable. And that information is useful to someone who's trying to treat them. So, there's kind of an interesting open question of, when we start to build these digital companions that are more lifelike, for people that don't have another companion to treat them, it's certainly better than nothing. But, how can we make it so that it's really beneficial?
A huge part of your history is working with brain-machine interfaces and developing that work in DARPA. So I'm curious what you given your work in DARPA, what do you think of first of all, what do you think of like the Neuralink efforts or progress or hype train, really, because of a certain name that's associated with it, like, which is appalling to me, especially given I don't know if you watched the presentation that was given in Neuralink, and it was god awful, but because it's Elon Musk, like they've now invented brain machine interfaces, it seems. So I don't know. That's kind of setting you up, but what do you think about that?
Well, I first off, I think, Neuralink, Kernel, Brian Johnson's effort,
yep,
the Facebook mental typewriter, they all came about because of our work at DARPA to catalyze that industry. And when I came to DARPA in 2014, there was kind of a stalled program that had done the the prosthetic control, for the motor cortex to control the robot arm for the quadriplegic patients. But it never advanced beyond the technology demonstration phase, and had been stalled for several years in terms of what sort of bandwidth could you deliver in and out of the brain, and what sort of interfaces could you imagine building. And so my goal in coming to DARPA in that era was to apply really the latest technologies in all the different fields, and bring them together, because what we found was even those early tech demos with the prosthetic control that was so revolutionary, and I don't want to downplay it, because those early demonstrations of plugging the wires into the cortex of the quadriplegic patient, Jeff Ling, that created that program, that was a watershed moment where we opened the door for the first time to the fact that yes, it's possible to control something electronic with your brain directly. And then they went on to, wire her up to an F-35 flight simulator and have her, become the plane, with her mental, capacity. It's just mind-boggling. So don't take this as a criticism. It's just that, DARPA up until that point had really been focused on getting to that technology demo, and then, would often lament about, this idea of the kind of the valley of death between that tech demo and the commercialization,
right?
And that technology had completely stalled. And one of the reasons for that was that just wasn't where they applied the money. There was no industrialization or productization in the budget. It was just show us that it's possible. And when we looked at those prototypes, they were using like 1980s class electronics that they could get through the FDA quickly. And so it was almost like stone knives and bear skins where they're shoving things into the brain. And, I just would cringe at that's never going to get into a healthy person that isn't already quadriplegic.
Right.
So I think that, my goal in coming to DARPA was, take the latest photonics, take the very latest computer science, take the latest, advanced node CMOS semiconductors that are really tiny and really power efficient. Take the latest wireless data transmission algorithms, take the latest neuroscience models, and integrate them in a system that could be kind of a platform for future development of the interfaces. And, when I got there, what I found was, 10 different industries that had never spent any time in the same room together.
Uh-huh.
And they weren't even aware of the level of capabilities. And so, the first role we played really was as kind of assembling the ecosystem and making all the key technology and science components aware that they had each individually reached a state that together, if they but collaborated, they could make these things happen. And it was fascinating. When we joked within DARPA that if you start a new program and you don't invent the internet or something equivalent, you get a B. And so we're all the program managers there are really pushed to be very aggressive in the tech development goals. And when we published our initial goals, we went through a really in-depth analysis from first principles of what is the energy of the transduction capability in a neuron. How much energy would you have to transfer to make a neuron fire? What is the efficiency of a transistor in a circuit, in the latest technology? Can we relay how much light with different photonic circuits? How efficient are semiconductor lasers? So we went through all of that. And we made some targets where we said, we think it should be physically possible to build an interface that would talk to 1 million neurons in parallel. Now, keep in mind that the latest technology at that point was 100 wires.
The Utah array?
That's right. That's right. And he showed up and said, no, we think we should be able to get to 1 million, and we're going to fund it, and we're going to, put $60 million behind it. But we're going to require that you assemble teams with the top talent in each one of these areas. And when we made that call for proposals, I would say 95% of the people responded, you don't really believe you can do that, do you? I mean, you're going to give us the money. I mean, we'll say we can do it, but you don't really think we can do it.
That's a good sign. That's a good sign, though. Right?
Well, and the interesting part was, we began hosting workshops and seminars where I would stand in front of the room and say, look, I've met with all of you, and I have to protect, each of your independent trade secrets and intellectual property. So I can't tell you, what I've learned from each of you in turn. But what I can tell you is that if you look at each segment of the problem, the CMOS circuitry, the telemetry, the power delivery, the neural interface, the genetic programming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In each one of those areas, some of you have demonstrated state-of-the-art capabilities sufficient to reach this scale. But none of you have been talking to each other.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And if you can assemble the teams to make it possible, you should be able to do wondrous things. And so we ended up funding six different groups after going through the whole proposal process. And they have done astounding things, some of which I think are quite far ahead of what was demonstrated in the recent Neuralink presentation.
Yeah.
So some of that's not public yet, so I can't really talk too much about it. But when Elon did the presentation, I congratulated him on the press because clearly I want to see them succeed. I'm very glad that that Elon and Brian and Facebook and GlaxoSmithKline and Google and all of them, they're in the industry. They're investing in it. They're putting money behind it. They're hiring teams, many of which were plucked from our, government funded programs. And they're using base technology that came out of the DARPA funded efforts in many cases. And so, I think that we very much want to see Elon succeed. And yeah, there's hype, I think, in some of the press. But they're making important advances. And I think that the industry is absolutely going to be one of the most impactful in our history, and is worthy of attention and investment. I'd love to see more excitement and support industrially for it.
So there's building something and there's understanding something. I'm wondering what the right balance is there. And I'm wondering, this is an awful question, but will brain-machine interfaces actually help us understand cognition? How we go from the hardware to, yeah, go ahead.
They're already doing it. The beauty of the DARPA work, it was demonstrated, handily, even before, the program around the brain-machine interfaces that I began had started. So just by hosting those workshops and getting the people to start collaborating that had never talked across those interdisciplinary boundaries before, even before we had funded the program, we had two groups that were able to transduce more than 1 million neurons in parallel on the sensory side. Mm-hmm. They hadn't integrated it into a miniature implantable device yet. They were doing it with benchtop machinery. But once people realized that it was possible, then the whole thing really accelerated. And so, and this isn't just to interface, because really to interface, you need to understand from an engineering perspective, what's the code? How is data represented? How can I, starting with an MPEG movie, how can I translate that into a pattern of impulses that I impose on the visual cortex so that you perceive that movie as if you're seeing it with your eyes?
Right.
And so, that's a really tricky technical problem that has a lot of fundamental biology in it that you can't really do one without the other. So I think that kind of the brain-machine interface and the advance in cognitive science are going to go hand in hand.
I hope so. So I know you're just about out of time. I just have a few quick, broad questions if you can answer them. I
Sure.
wanted to dive deeper into consciousness, but I'll just ask you this. When will we build consciousness?
Well, that's a great question. I think part of it depends on your definition of consciousness.
Yeah, of course.
There, any medical student will give you like 3 or 4 different aspects of consciousness. So from, self-awareness to,
subjective experience.
Talking about how awake and aware are you? Can you attend to things? Can you remember? I think that, but there's one fundamental aspect that I think has been unsung for quite some time, and it is really whether or not you can predict a future event. And I think that your level of consciousness is fundamentally tied to the level of complexity of what you can predict. And so I gave a talk not too long ago where one of the questions at the end of the talk is, well, bacteria, in the ocean, or plankton in the ocean, seem to be able to predict when the sun's going to come up and swim to the top to get, light shine on.
Yeah.
Are they consciousness? And in that sense, and I said, well, in terms of rudimentary prediction, I would say, yes, that's rudimentary consciousness. And if you look at the predictive capabilities of the human brain versus the predictive abilities of your dog, is your dog conscious? I believe the dog is conscious.
My dog is not conscious, but that's okay.
Well, I can tell you, my dog is definitely, exhibiting signs of consciousness. I don't know if you've ever seen that. There's a great series of YouTube videos where you can see kind of the dog's development of object permanence, and you as a person kind of go together, where you kind of stand behind a towel and let it drop as you duck off to the side behind a door or something, and you can absolutely see the dog's expectations violated and surprised.
Oh yeah.
And so, these are systems where they were clearly predicting something that didn't happen, and now they're attending to the difference. And I think those sorts of things really are fundamental in consciousness, and our capabilities we can absolutely build into machines. And I think, whether they're conscious or not, I think is going to be, an ongoing debate as we, incrementally improve it. But every year, these things are going to be behaving more and more like real people do, and the difference is going to be harder to distinguish as we go.
Was Marvin Minsky a good thesis advisor?
Oh, he was great. He was one of those. It's like he's one of those people that had, a legacy of advisees who had advisees.
Yeah.
So I was directly advised by Marvin. And then I was also advised by Tom Knight, who was also a student of Marvin's. Yeah. And I was advised by Jerry Sussman, who was a student of Marvin's.
Yes, yeah.
And Tom was a student of Marvin and Jerry. So, it's like the generational advancements of access to kind of, how do you think innovative thoughts and create new stuff that has impact? It's, you spend time in the company of those people, and you can't stop thinking about those things.
Oh, it's great. It's great to spend time with good people. That's one of the reasons I do this show. What's something that you used to believe that you now consider naive?
Well, I used to believe that, if you would have asked me, say, even 5 years ago, how long my children would live.
Okay.
I probably would have said, maybe to 90. But I don't believe that anymore.
Now what do you believe?
I think they'll be in the 130 to 150 range.
Man. That's going to be great. Are you going to be around to see it?
I hope so, but I think I may have missed the window. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a great place to end it. So, I have so many more questions, but I really appreciate you answered a bunch of my questions. So I really appreciate your time. I wish you much success moving forward with BrainWorks. And of course, Phillip, don't be evil. And thanks for your time, Phillip. No,
my pleasure. And, if I can help out in the future, please reach out.
All right.
And for those people looking for academic advice, just find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, you are at Alvelda on Twitter, and I'll link to it in the show notes as well. All right. Thanks,
Perfect.
Phillip. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.